Hey guys, I got a pretty short video for you today. All we're going to talk about is the signs for our trigonometric functions. Signs is in positive or negative sign for all the different functions and the different quadrants. Now that's important because depending on which quadrant we're in, we could have a positive or a negative sine, cosine, or tangent value that's associated with it, and our negatives really do affect a lot of our answers, and it also contributes to our range of our values. So as we go through, it's important to understand this section because this is something that will come up throughout the entire year, and if you have a good grip on in which quadrants things are positive or negative, then that'll make your life a lot easier in chapter 6 when we talk about our different radian values for those different quadrants. So we've already drawn this picture before. We know that we can draw reference triangles in any one of our quadrants. So I'm going to start with quadrant 1. This is our reference angle. It's always formed between the terminal side and the x-axis. And we labeled these as our opposite adjacent side, but on the last video we labeled this as our y value, our x value, and our r value, thinking that this here is some coordinate point x comma y, so this is the change in our y and this is the change in our x for that coordinate point. We've also defined our sine value as our opposite over our hypotenuse, which in this triangle now, if this is my angle that I'm standing at, that would be our y over our r. And our cosine, likewise, we've defined that already as our adjacent over our hypotenuse. And again, in that triangle, our adjacent side is r, x, and r. I'm also going to do tangent, just because. Tangent, we know, is the opposite over adjacent. So in this picture, it's going to be our y over our x. Now I want to remind you too, based on the notes that we did yesterday, that r value, this distance or this hypotenuse of our triangle, this is going to always be considered positive. And that's going to help us determine then in which quadrants functions are positive or negative. So we're going to make a list. So we're going to start with quadrant 1. And we're going to figure out which functions are positive in quadrant 1. So thinking about quadrant 1, both our x and y coordinates are positive. So if I were going to come up with the sine value of any of these things, my y value is going to be positive in quadrant 1. My r value is always positive. So in quadrant 1, sine is positive, and therefore cosecant is positive. Is my x value positive in quadrant 1? Sure is. So that means that my cosine ratio of our x value over our r is also positive in quadrant 1. So cosine and therefore secant is also positive in quadrant 1. And our tangent, the ratio of x and y, both these things are positive, so that means the ratio is going to be positive. So tangent is also positive in quadrant 1, as well as cotangent. So everything in quadrant 1 is positive. Okay, let's look at quadrant 2. So in quadrant 2, my x value is negative and my y value is positive. So is my sine positive? Well, my y value is positive and my r value is positive, so sine and therefore cosecant are positive in quadrant 2. Is my x value positive in quadrant 2? Definitely not. So that means that my ratio of my x value and my always positive r value is not positive. It's negative in quadrant 2, so I'm not going to list that. In our tangent, well, if tangent is y over x and y is positive and x is negative, that means that this ratio is going to be negative. So we are going to have a negative tangent value in quadrant 2. Alright, let's look at quadrant 3. Quadrant 3, both our x and our y coordinates are negative. So if I'm looking at my sine, my y value is negative, my r value is positive, so I'm going to have a negative function value for sine in quadrant 3. For cosine, my x is negative, my r is positive, so again, negative value. For tangent, my y is negative, my x is negative, a negative or negative is going to be a positive. So tangent and cotangent are the only ones that are positive in quadrant 3. forget that. And finally, quadrant 4. In quadrant 4, we have a positive x value and a negative y value. So looking at our sine, deciding if that's positive or negative, my y value is negative, my r value is positive, so that's going to be negative in quadrant 4. My x value is positive, my r value is positive, so our cosine and secant are going to be positive in quadrant 4. And our tangent value, well, our y value is negative, my x value is positive. That's going to be overall negative then in quadrant 4. So a lot of what you'll see later on in your notes and your practice, you'll see something like, okay, well, I know that this is located, or they'll give you like the cosine value, and then they'll say the tangent's also positive, and blah blah blah, and you'll have to figure out what quadrant you're in as a key component to solving the rest of the problem, because if you know what quadrant you're in, then you can tell the signs of other things, and you'll have to use that to come up with the ratio for some of those other ratios that you are unaware of. So if you can kind of read these things and understand that this means positive and negative, what we kind of just did here, and then in reverse figure out which quadrants then they lie, you're going to be in better shape for the rest of the year. So right now, and for example 1, we know that tangent is positive and cosine is negative. So tangent is only positive in quadrant 1 and quadrant 3. So cosine being negative really means that it can't be quadrant 1, so it has to be quadrant 3. It's like a process of elimination. I like to think about cosine acting as my x value, because that's the only thing that is affecting whether it's positive or negative. Our r values are always positive, and then our tangent is going to be like the ratio of x and y. So if I know that cosine is negative and tangent is positive, that means that we must have to have a negative or a negative to get something that's positive for tangent. So we have to have sine be negative too, which would mean that x and y both would be negative, and we'd be lying in quadrant 3. For example 2, we know that our sine is positive and our cotangent is negative. So again, sine is really like our y value. That's the only thing that's directionally depending on our value there. So sine, I know, is positive in these two quadrants, because that's where my, these two quadrants, because that's where my y value is. That was cosine that I just pointed to. Sine is positive in quadrants 1 and 2. If cotangent's negative, that means that the ratio of x and y is a negative number, and if sine, our y value, is positive, then x must be negative, so we must be lying here in quadrant 2. And if cosecant is of alpha is negative, that really means sine. So again, that's kind of like our y value. It's not exactly our y value, especially for cosecant, but that's the only thing that is making it negative or positive is the y value. It's associated with the y. And our secant, which is cosine, which is our x value, is positive. So where is our y value negative and our x value positive? Well, that happens here in quadrant 4. So again, it's really important that we can understand, given these information, work backwards to come up with the quadrants. And that's why like today is kind of the main focus of that. So if you can get on board with those things and get really good at that, your life in trig will be much easier, come November. So for the rest of your homework tonight, since this video is really, really short, your job is to complete the following practice problems. So the next day, like on Monday when we come back, we're not going to practice any of the trig function signs. We're moving on to something different. So this is like your in-class practice today. It's just at-home practice with just deciding what quadrants for the angles are given. And then I'll post the answers to those two on the website, so that way you can double check your answers and come in on Monday with any questions that you have.